All right. Welcome to everyone listening or watching to the second installment of my conversation with Dave Collins. We're going to be doing something a little differently than we had planned, as current events dictate. Today is February 24th, 2022, and Russia has launched a pretty full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's uncertain at the moment the extent to which the ramifications that will have for Russia, for Ukraine, for the world. There's a lot of uncertainty and fear, perhaps even some despair, and great worry for the suffering of everyone involved. That's what I feel, anyway. So what Dave and I think we'd like to do is talk a little bit about how contemplative practice and contemplative experience, how that intersects with social and political engagement, as well as when social and political forces intervene in one's life in disruptive or disastrous ways, what kind of support those practices and experiences can provide for us human beings in times of trouble. Does that sound good, Dave?
It does. And a first thing that comes to mind is I'm rather heartbroken by events today, and others may have used this, but I'm remembering Stephen Levine, Vipassana-oriented American Buddhist. I think he recently passed. Did work in hospice and grief counseling. And what I'm remembering is his suggestion that we can understand and engage with the perspective that when our hearts are breaking, they're breaking open. So that sense of being all the more present, all the more human, all the more grounded. A lot of meditation is associated with chilling out. But of course, many traditions will welcome the reminder that really getting in touch with being is to cultivate an intimacy with worth and value and beauty and love. A rather direct symbolization of that is the Yabum image in Mahayana, especially Tantra, sexual union. And there can be somewhat different applications, but the sort of fundamental understanding is that she represents wisdom. Prajna Paramita happens to be grammatically feminine in Sanskrit, and that's her. The feminine, the female represents wisdom, wisdom into being, wisdom into the nature of life. And he represents compassionate action, skillful means. So she's insight, presence, clarity. He's love and embodiment and caretaking, compassion. And you can get a little on the theoretical side, but it seems to make eminent sense to me, the suggestions that they're twinned, they're together. And by constitution, we may be more oriented toward wisdom practices or more towards devotion and compassion, service practices. But at their healthy foundation, each supports and ultimately is not a different thing from the other. So saying that, it can get kind of symbolic, it can get kind of wordy, but it's about a practice and it's about an experience. And yeah, I welcome your invitation to reflect on how heartbreaking events, personally and globally, are to be engaged or can be entered into with contemplative perspectives and contemplative meditative practices. What comes up for you in that regard?
I'm reminded of, at least within the Buddhist tradition, the kind of central axis on which practice begins, and practice is concerned with the first noble truth, that of suffering, unsatisfactoriness, of dukkha. That I know for myself and for many others, what brings us to practice isn't a fascination with these things for their own sake, although there may also be that. But because life is difficult, because there is suffering, we experience it ourselves, we see it in others, and we're looking for tools, for practices, for help. And the desire to practice is almost a stirring of compassion and wisdom, just there in the recognition of suffering, of one's own suffering, of others' suffering. And that wisdom, that compassion is seeking out a means to help oneself and possibly to help others.
I'm trained as a psychotherapist, and occasionally raise an eyebrow with this suggestion, but it makes eminent sense to me. Many kinds of psychotherapy and different models and psychological personality theories. But I think it's utterly fair to understand psychotherapy as a form of meditation, where typically embodied in two people, say, you're looking to have a open-hearted, open-eyed presence, which especially I'm kind of humanistic oriented. And for me, the humanistic approach, in my own words, can be summarized as sort of, if you want to help somebody change, love them the way they are. That sort of positive regard, that sort of acceptance, that sort of just kind engagement and presence. I know you're aware, sometimes just with ourselves, just sitting, we become, again, this is my language, we become a safe enough place for whatever healing we're ready for to come up and out, to come up and have us. Folks who've done intensive meditation, folks who've done extended retreats, this isn't any new information, but sometimes it's a little surprise to folks who haven't. I'm in silent meditation, and I'm typically one of these folks who, 30, 40 people in a room just sitting looking at a wall. 3-4 days into it, a third of us are crying. Just sitting there. And again, I don't have, and I don't feel particularly a need to have a real fast articulated theory for it. But it does seem to me an exercise in a kind of naturalness, that when we're less distracted, when we're less scattered, when we're less engaged in politics or philosophy or argumentation, when we're sitting on our butt, touching the earth, allowing ourselves to be touched by what's matter-of-factly true, it's healing, it's loving. It's a matter, again, these are all metaphors, but it's a matter as much of the heart as it is of the mind or brain.
just a comment there. It's interesting to note, as I'm sure you know, that in Pali, in Sanskrit, and in the East Asian translations of these Buddhist terms, the chitta, or the mind, like what's usually rendered as either the heart or the mind, or the heart mind in English, those are two different words. The emotions and cognition are recognized, and in fact, science now has pretty. It's kind of a open and shut the case here. They are not at all separate.
Right. And in East Asia, Shin, the character in Chinese and Japanese, similarly means heart and mind. And so a lot of the Zen adages I'm fond of recalling, where they use the word mind, it is also the word heart. So a tradition of direct pointing to the heart.
Yeah, that sounds a little less forbidding than direct pointing at the human mind. The human heart. Oh, that sounds warm, inviting.
Indeed. Indeed it is. And another trope or kind of stereotype sometimes of meditative traditions or meditative practice is that it's individual, especially Western presumptions, that it's socially isolated or withdrawn from the world. And on a day like today, I'm reminded of how very much contemplative practice, meditative touching our hearts and our lives is of a piece with social action, with political engagement, with letting those around us and letting those in the world be reminded of there being a more wholesome, productive way. A icon, of course, of that it's the work of Mahatma Gandhi and his Satyagraha, which translates, I think, etymologically as sort of grasping, holding the truth. Graha related to our grasp. Satya, I'm pretty sure related also to the Sanskrit sat, just the being, the truth of being. To hold to what is most wholesome, most real, is ultimately a political act. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was informed by Gandhi's outlook and translated into his own Christian social practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, and engaged Buddhism. I don't know his work real well, his story, but if I remember correctly, with the horrors of the Vietnam War, he just knew he couldn't stay in a monastery. The kind of worth and wonder he was cultivating as a monk was something to be shared and embodied and engaged socially. The Berrigan brothers, death row workers, very much informed by a type of spirituality which is all about being lived.
This strikes a chord because when I started out when I started out looking for traditions to enter into, teachers to learn from, I kind of made a relatively ignorant survey of the Buddhist traditions on offer that seemed workable for me to enter into, because at the time I was intending on ordaining as one variety or another of monk, and it was Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged form of Buddhism that really struck a chord, because for myself I didn't see any difference between taking care of oneself and taking care of the world. In fact, taking care of one's own suffering so that one can be of service to the world. That seemed of a piece, and that was explicitly laid out there, directly with engagement in not necessarily taking partisan sides in political conflict, but understanding that spiritual work is not separate from all of human life.
And I'm reminded, again, playing with etymologies, I think this is accurate, that the words ordained and ordinary are cognate, they're related. And I always like that with kind of the image of the Buddha touching the earth. Just what's most real, what's in its way healthy in the sense of most ordinary is also what's most precious, what's most beautiful, what's most sacred.
The phrase I see you use often is "what's always already here," what's always already true.
Yeah.
And indeed, that is something that's most ordinary. It's the most ordinary thing.
Yeah.
Very difficult to see, very difficult to notice, but not anything extraordinary.
Except perhaps in the sense of the comedian Stephen Wright, the absurdist fellow, when asked what his shirt size was, he said it's extra medium.
Sure.
So extraordinary in that sense of being all the more the way things are.
Right, right. We're at a point with things in the geopolitical situation where, you know, if you're someone like me, you know, of not much influence in the wider world, you know, we're not in contact with secretaries of defense. We don't have large sums of money that we can donate to worthy causes. I guess this is where I've had this question myself. It's a live question. You know, these are things that deeply stir my emotions. They engage my capacity to respond, and yet there isn't an immediate action that can be taken. And so I turn to practice for myself to both, you know, make sure that I'm not overwhelmed, so that I continue to be available to the people around me, even though I can't directly respond to the, you know, the greater suffering. Just that wasn't really a question, but I wonder if you have any response to that.
I do, because it immediately reminds me of how much healthy social engagement, and whether it's the people in our house or the political structures that we inhabit, how much healthy engagement is a matter of doing what your heart says do. And if we're going to embody our heart, we kind of sort of, it behooves us, it benefits us, and it benefits the world to have some intimacy with our hearts. So I was in another meeting today where reference was made to the political act of sitting meditation across the street from the governor's mansion. This happened to be in Texas, at the time of a prisoner's execution. Just showing up. Now, there are, of course, much more active possibilities too, but that already, in a kind of sort of literal way, meditating as a political act, just being present, just witnessing something our heart tells us is not okay. It's not how our world should be. It's not how human beings should comport themselves, should act. Just sitting meditation across the street from the governor's mansion when someone's being executed in a prison.
Just that fact of being present, or not that fact, that act, that practice of being present and of becoming intimate with the 10,000 things. I like that way that phrase that Dogen uses. That's quite radical. It seems to me that most problems interpersonally, politically, you know, you could continue all the problems, or most of the ones that anything can be done about, come about through the human mind's tendency to fabricate, to conceptualize, to step away from that intimacy.
Yeah.
And that seems a rather, that might be trite or precious in the kind of unelaborated way I've said it there, but I really do think that something like that is true.
Yeah, that comes through. That comes through to me, at least in what you're saying. 10,000 was the biggest number for which the Chinese language character system had a single character. And so the Chinese, and then of course the Japanese, like Dogen following on, will use that one character as a gesture towards everything, the 10,000 things. But it still has a little bit of that concrete quality, because you're not just saying infinity or everything. But your comment also reminds me how in Dogen, Genjo Koan, his essay, and this is a paraphrase, suggests that when we bring ourselves to bear on the things of the world, there's delusion. When we allow the things of the world to bring themselves to bear on us, there's awakening. And so with this conversation, I'm again reminded of the spirit of that, of being present, being available to what's always already here, before we have a philosophy about it, before we have a conceptualization of it. What our hearts, what our bodies already know, if and when we give them a chance, if and when we get, often it's quiet, but doesn't have to be quiet. I was in another conversation today where, of course, another rich, contemplative, spiritual, engaged tradition is the Sufi current in Islam, and how the story has it that Rumi, there were Sufis before Rumi, but he sets up an order, the Mevlevi dervishes. Story has it, well, he in effect fell in love with a spiritual teacher, and the sense I always get at Shams of Tabriz, the image I have of them when they see each other, they're like two mirrors that you put in front of each other, and just cascades of insights and associations and beauty. So he meets Shams, and poetry starts flowing out of him for the rest of his life. Tens of thousands of lines of poetry. But the story has it that he's praying, or he's doing a little chant, and he's doing a walking meditation effectively. And he's in a mosque and reaches out his hand and touches a pillar and spins around it, and the world cracked open. And so he inaugurated that kind of meditation, a dance, the turning, the whirling dervishes. And of course, the Sufis were married. The Sufis had jobs. So very much a model. I'm looking to combine this artistic, this poet, this dancer who had kids, and poetry's flowing out of him. So again, just the motif of an embodiment and an engagement that's simultaneously ordinary and infused with beauty and the movement of our hearts.
Yeah, that's just so lovely. Kind of there are throughout different contemplative traditions, kind of different models of the ideal spiritual practitioner. Some are more renunciant, some are more engaged, more towards a kind of ordinariness. But I think something that they share, an element common to both, is, and this is both in theory and in practice, that if you get in contact with that, whatever word or metaphor that tradition chooses to use for it, the pre-reflective openness in experience, if you get in contact with it, that has an effect on the human heart, on the human person, on the personality, on the activity, which tends to be caring, which tends to be loving.
And I'm also reminded, I had the good fortune to visit Konya, Turkey, some years back, and to witness the dervish ceremony. In the decades since, they've been able to leave and go around the world. So lots of people have seen the dervish ceremony. Those days are a little more politically restricted. I won't go into that. But your comment reminds me, I'm at the ceremony with a lot of other people, and it's on a basketball court. But when they started to turn and the music is playing, it was transformative. It was like being in mixing traditions here, but a Buddha land, a heaven. And on the one hand, it was altered for me. And on the other hand, the alteration, I want to say, was towards being all the more ordinary. The beauty that's already possible to us. They're dancing. They're just men, human beings, dancing with music playing. And somehow being that intimate to their experience, being that out from under their mere thoughts and opinions, being that enlivened was transformative.
Yeah, the words have stopped. They'll come back
Right.
shortly.
Maybe we'll start singing or something.
Okay, I remember where the train of thought was before it disappeared. This kind of breaking down the distinction between the sacred and the mundane. That's one way of putting it, or the immanent and the transcendent. It's a major theme, and I think it has a lot to do with disabusing ourselves of this distinction or separation between our activity in the world as fully human and our activity as spiritual practitioners, getting beyond the human. That's one way you could say it.
Right.
I'm reminded of during my time in Plum Village in France, one of the methods of training was to repeat gathas, short little verses, to remind yourself to be mindful as you go about your activities. And my favorites were those that had to do with brushing your teeth, or using the bathroom, or sweeping the floor, that you're meant to be practicing exactly as diligently, perhaps even more so, as you're going about the routine activities of your life in the monastery or outside of it, in the courtroom, in a political arena. All the more so, you need that kind of openness, that kind of wise caring that can come about as a result of practice.
Right. May have used this story in our previous conversation. One of the mythic legendary tales included in the Zen koan collections. The Buddha has just given a Dharma talk, and a bunch of people get awakened, and it's a lovely, wonderful the event, and somebody wants to commemorate what has happened here and what's been shared, and so we should build a temple. And the god Indra that's there, the archangel Indra, plants a blade of grass in the ground and says, "The temple's built." It can make all the sense in the world for us to set aside special places, special techniques, special times, holy days, holidays, to remind us that it's all holy. Having a special time to be reconnected in such a way that everything is a joy and a wonder and a privilege to be a part of.
I'm reminded of an interview with a Zen master. I'll perhaps link it in the show notes. I can't actually remember who it is, but it's a wrinkled, wizened Zen master being interviewed, and he says at one point, the point of Zen really is to become as one was as a little child, in open awe, fascination, and intimacy with one's own experience, with others, with the world, and to act from that place. And it's not, some traditions would have that if you come from that place of radical openness and intimacy, then you can do no wrong. I'm not sure I would go that far, but
right.
You're probably going to be more aware of what you're doing that's right and what you're doing that's wrong, and more sensitive to feedback. That's the hope, anyway.
Right. I'm also reminded Thich Nhat Hanh's suggestion, and you can put different things in the blank here. Take good care of your anger. Take good care of your sadness. The image he also used was to put your arm around your difficulty as a way both to contain it, not have it determine our behaviors, not have us act out from that difficulty or that hurt or that anger. Put your arm around your anger. Take good care of your anger. Also as a way to look into it, to have a relationship with it. What is this about? Not to get too soapboxy, but with that little image, I'm reminded of how far contemporary Western psychology has to go to catch up with the world's contemplatives, the kind of healing wisdom that's always been a part of the wisdom traditions, the spiritual practice traditions, the contemplative currents in what we tend to call religious cultures, societies.
Yeah, I've had, unfortunately, a lot of contact with the psychological modalities and establishments. And for where I was in my life at the time, I was a little too far gone to be helped by cognitive behavioral therapy or regular talk therapy. It's pretty immersed in a thorough depression for a long time. And I kind of got my way out through embodiment, actually, primarily.
Okay.
Embodiment and really coming back to life, so to speak, through the body, not through language, not through words, not through my concepts, because that was my prison, more or less.
So I invite you, to the extent that you're so inclined to say more in that regard. It immediately reminds me of, one, there's different levels, there can be different styles of depression. Manic depression's got a pretty heavy genetic load for a lot of people, and biochemical, to just be a kind of sadness that gets involutional, gets turned inward and doesn't process as a natural grief. And so, not one size fits all kind of recommendation, but I'm reminded of how often, as a therapist, I've invited folks who are feeling depression to act as if they're not. For some people, getting out and doing things they would ordinarily do if they weren't depressed can be helpful. Things like exercise, walking by the lake, riding a bicycle. And for you, there was a somatic and embodied engaged sort of activity that was healing?
Yeah, absolutely. More so than anything else, I think. Uh, my my depression lasted pretty much throughout my adolescence, and it wasn't manic depression. It was being trapped in a cage of my thoughts, my feelings, and in a mutually reinforcing cycle of social isolation and kind of just thinking, more thinking, feeling bad, thinking about how I'm feeling bad, talking about how I'm feeling bad with other people, and then thinking more, and taking it all in as something that was deeply wrong with me and that I was somehow responsible for, as one is wont to do, as an adolescent without really a clear understanding of many things.
And perhaps with a sense that this is forever.
Exactly. It's bad now. It's getting worse, in fact, and it will never improve. And it was really quite terrible. Not to mince words.
Yeah, depression is pain.
But what helped? There were two kind of pivotal things, I would say. One, I had the privilege to partake in the program Outward Bound. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes.
So that for me took the form of 3 or more weeks. I think it was about 28 days, just out canoeing for hours and hours every day, with no books, no entertainment, except for the company of other people, and one's immediate environment, taking whatever each day had, and getting through it. And through that, this was when I was about 14. I kind of, during that period, kind of really came back to a sense of health and well-being. Unfortunately, after that, coming back home, I kind of resubmerged into patterns and behaviors, and that kind of got me down even deeper than I was before. And what it took, again, in the end, was don't know if you're familiar, probably are here in the field. There's wilderness therapy. So again, it was kind of a very long hiking trips, with group and individual therapy as well. Although again, I would say, for me at least, I'm sure this isn't everybody's experience, but it was actually just the break from old habits, old environments that triggered thoughts, triggered feelings, and immersion in an essentially healthy way of being with oneself and with others, physically engaged, that kind of got me back to a place of health and of, I wasn't happy, but I was I was not dysfunctionally depressed. And from there, I turned to contemplative practice.
I've had times of depression, and on intensive retreats, stuff comes up. But with your story, I'm reminded, I've mostly practiced Vipassana and Soto Zen through San Francisco Zen Center style, American Soto, but did a couple of Rinzai Zen retreats where they use koans, these kind of provocations, these little stories or puzzles that help us frustrate the mind and allow the chance that something more fundamental can up and out. And in my case, I'm reminded through some of what you shared, I was given the koan. I forget exactly how it goes, but a man is blind and he is deaf. How are you going to teach him the Dharma? And I was in a lot of physical pain at the time, got full-on depression type feelings, and started somehow opening up to the natural beauty of the place, the life of the place, the animals of the place. And I told my teacher eventually, this blind and deaf person How are you going to teach him the Dharma? How are you going to transform him? How are you going to help him awake? I said, I'd get him a dog. Something alive and loving and natural. Bit of an extension, but that's what comes up for me in reflecting on what you just shared. Getting back to the woods, getting back to something that moves, getting back to our animal, soft-bodied person.
It's also interesting that different traditions have different degrees of involvement and place different importance on realizing practice through the body. In Zen, it's quite important. In Tantra, it's very important. Sounds like in Sufism, it's quite important. Although interestingly, and this is something I've seen acknowledged more and more in the kind of mindfulness that has been imported and mass marketed, it can often be quite disconnected from the body, in some of the ways that it's taught. And I suppose that just leaves room, for a fuller understanding, a fuller publicization of the range of practices and perspectives that have informed and enriched and improved people's lives over all of human history. There's a vast array of which only a small part gets popularized, which is unfortunate. So much work to be done.
And I'm very fond, if not in fact insistent, on asking of spiritual teachings, and there's lots of kinds and lots of styles, but of asking of spiritual teachings, religious concepts, not as if true or false, right or wrong, not if I believe it at all, but how does this work? What is the healthy potential here, and does it work for me? So I'm reminded in what you've said, how much ascetic practices there are through human history and often associated with of course, spiritual traditions and dualistic models. Like I've been reading some Plato and I've got a long ways to go to really understand what that guy is up to. But among the things I'm seeing is he's telling stories. He's having people talk to one another, and he'll contradict himself from one dialogue to the next. But the sort of dualism that gets associated with Plato between, sort of discarding or discounting or even denigrating the body and giving priority and value and esteem to the soul, the psyche, or some idea that is not corporeal or scattered into multiple embodiments. That can be a story, a practice model, inviting us not to get distracted by our notions, and to recollect, to remember, to collect again, to embody again, something more original than our thought up ideas, to play with Plato's language, to look for the idea behind the idea, the living truth before the mere opinions.
And perhaps even whatever identity remains beneath or in the absence of our usual sense of ourselves and our notions and how intertwined those are. And on that note, I think I'd like to circle back. I remember at the beginning of our conversation, we had an intention. I think we've covered briefly, but well, I think in the short time we have, a number of things, but the ultimate lack of distinction between the sacred, the mundane, the political, the spiritual. We've touched it lightly, a little on those. And I'm wondering if we could spend some time moving into the last section of our conversation together on just what, especially if someone doesn't already have a deep practice, something that is easy, accessible, and very sustaining. What's kind of possible for a person in confronting is probably not the word, in taking care of one's sadness, taking care of one's fear, especially in times such as these, when there's war, there is great uncertainty in all areas of life.
I hadn't quite thought of this way before, and it's a little made up on my part, but the Buddhist centrality of transience, of impermanence, of things changing. Suzuki Roshi, founder of San Francisco Zen Center, once said that all the Buddhist teaching on impermanence can be summarized in 2 words: not always so. And I'm reminded in context of this conversation, I'm feeling drawn to make a comment on suicidality. That's a forever thing. And it is not uncommon with depression to have thoughts of whether this is worth it, whether I can go on, and of course to have plans or even attempts. Again, a kind of reflection of how awfully painful and hopeless it can feel sometimes when depression has us, and how, while it's also true statistically, people who do attempt suicide not uncommonly have had attempts at other times in their life. But it's also true, and this is the point I really want to underscore, people who get on the other side of a suicide attempt or a period of feeling suicidal 3-4 months later are typically really glad they didn't do it. Depression messes with our thoughts. Depression stains the way we see the world. And it can be tragically hard to remember. But if we've got friends, if we've got maybe ourselves, something we journaled, a note to ourselves, befriending ourselves, this isn't forever. These things change. And again, when the cloud lifts, people who have had suicidal times are typically really glad they didn't. They see things different. They feel things different.
I can personally attest. Throughout much of my time depressed, I struggled with pretty persistent, intrusive, suicidal thoughts. I fortunately never made any serious attempts, but it was always in the back of my mind, lurking like an unhealthy and bothersome friend that just won't stop pestering you. And I can gladly say that I'm very glad that they remained thoughts and inclinations, never escalated. I want as well to say something on your phrase. Depression kind of stains the way that we see the world. I think in one sense, that's kind of what a lot of contemplative practice comes down to, is in ways of seeing the world. I don't know if you're familiar with the late Rob Burbea's work.
Oh, Burbea, yes, a little bit. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful teacher.
Really, really great, and tragically lost too soon to cancer. But that's a central theme in his work, in understanding different ways of taking up with the world, different insightful ways of looking that invite different ways of seeing the world. And it's been my experience retrospectively that depression is a kind of, I want to say
Right.
disordered, but I don't mean that in a way to condemn the experience. It's right. It puts a pall over the entirety of your perception, of yourself, of your emotions, of your thoughts, like a gray fog or a cloud has infected even your experience of external sight, external sound. And perhaps in times like these, those clouds come rolling back in for people, or if they haven't had them before, they may begin to experience them. And just as you've said, all things are transient. And noticing that can make a great deal of difference in the moment.
And as you open the discussion with the Buddhist appreciation of the unsatisfactoriness of our habitual engagement with ourselves and one another in the world, that unsatisfactoriness, the dukkha, also translated very commonly as the suffering that stains our habitual way of being in the world. I'm reminded with what you just alluded to, suffering is a kind of evaluative, has an evaluative component to it, and is ultimately, as the whole Buddhist tradition is about informing us, is suffering is ultimately an option. It's not required. Pain is not so optional. But if and when we can stay close to our breaking hearts as something that is a movement of our life force, how pain is something vital, is something living, is a reminder of the well, in my case, the reminder that I don't know everything, and to be only a little coy, what a privilege it is not to know everything. To be thrown into this wonderful, mysterious, miraculous story. I alluded to last time how sometimes I've had the experience of meditating in my sleep. What on earth is going on there? And it helps me appreciate, one, again, I don't know everything. Two, it's an utter wonder, this event. Sleep is something our bodies, again, speaking slightly metaphorically, something our bodies know how to do. Dreams is something our hearts and minds and bodies get together and make a production for us, an entertaining processing of materials and experiences, and being awake and having thoughts and language. That's a story. I have no idea how I'm doing this. and the sort of stepping away from the habit, the pro forma, the routine, and stepping all the more into the wonder of it. I was trying to think of what spiritual image was coming to my mind. It's a moment in the Talking Heads movie, Stop Making Sense, where David Byrne looks at his hand and says, "How do I work this?"
Yeah, there's that's a lot of richness in what you just said. Something I'd like to touch on, maybe elaborate, is that being free of suffering doesn't mean kind of dissociating from pain.
Right.
In fact, dissociating from pain, turning away from pain, physical or emotional, tends to amplify it. In fact, perhaps you can suppress it for a time, but it solidifies, it puts down roots, and so being with one's pain, taking care of one's pain. That's the way. A hard learned lesson for me anyway. That might be slow.
I'm going to throw a little bit of another angle onto it. In the contemplative work alluded to in our last talk, A Cloud of Unknowing, a fellow, probably Carthusian, didn't sign his name, 14th century, writing a book on how to meditate, how to do contemplative prayer. And he alludes to times when things get difficult, stuff comes up, how to work with it. And I'm going to back into his first suggestion by the second suggestion is one we've kind of touched on in spirit, at least in this conversation. He says, when you just can't let it go, take seriously the prospect that it's there for a reason and let it have you. In his language, give yourself up to the divine in the hands of your enemies. Give yourself up to God. Consider it folly to strive against this anymore. Let this have you. Take good keep of this slight, I pray thee. Pay good attention to this technique, I urge you. For methinks with the practice of it, you will melt all to water.
Melt all to water.
Sometimes our stuff comes up. Yeah. Sometimes our stuff comes up, and sometimes our stuff is holding us until we pay some damn attention to our lived experience. So that's kind of a theme. That's sort of the spirit of much of what we've looked at and explored, I feel, in this conversation. But I'm also reminded of another option, which I at least want to allude to. The first technique, he says, is to ignore it. Look past it. Don't get into it. Don't allow this distraction. Look over its shoulder to what your actual intent is. Look towards the beauty. Look towards the divine. That's more fundamental than this distraction. Let it go. So he's given a balanced teaching. The second one is what I said before, is you let it go and you let it go and you let it go, and it doesn't let go of you. Take seriously the prospect, there's something going on here, and look into it, let it have you. And this is potentially a silly analogy, but I think I'm right in remembering in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, Harrison Ford's character is at one point accosted by a scimitar-wielding bad guy. And the script called for Harrison's character to disarm the bad guy with his bullwhip. So Indy has a whip and he's in the script, and Harrison tries to do it and it doesn't work. And in the story, this point in the story, his love interest has been absconded and kidnapped, and they're driving away, and this guy's in his way. He tries it again with the rope, and it doesn't work. And the actor, Harrison, remembers his character has a 44 on his hip. And so when the whip didn't work, in the next take, he just picks out his pistol and boom. And Spiegel says, print it. It's a cartoonish association, but just as a reminder, in addition to sort of engaging with our life as it's presenting, our material, our hurts, our pains, sometimes, well, I'm also reminded of the story of a young Western woman who's in an ashram in India who keeps getting sexually harassed at the market. There's some guy, she's not from here, so he can get away, he thinks, with being inappropriate. And one day she just loses it and is cussing him out and has lost her temper. She turns around and there's her teacher. and she's embarrassed for being so emotional and angry. And he says to her, you know, if it were I think I would take my umbrella and with loving kindness hit him over the head. This sense of, in addition to, letting it have us sometimes just getting up and moving on. Just, again, kind of the motif of being materially engaged, being embodied, marshaling other resources and strengths we might have, getting up and going for a walk.
Well, as it is with so much of this, there isn't a pat and rote formula which we can all use immediately with wonderful results, but a skillful balancing of turning towards what is difficult, engaging with it on its own terms, and turning away to titrate, to regain strength, or in some cases to genuinely transcend the object, which is so vexing us.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's a good place to end.
I think so. Feels good.
All right. Well, may everyone be well. May everyone be safe, and may all conflicts everywhere cease as quickly as possible.
Take care.
That's my wish anyway. Take care.